Thanks for coming, everyone. This is a great crowd. This event is part of Townsend Collaborative Research Seminar series that we're running this year, which includes both public talks and a seminar with graduate students. So we're really pleased to have Luciana Parisi here. Professor Parisi is professor in the Department of Literature at Duke University. She previously taught at Goldsmiths College in London and was for a year visiting professor in the Department of Rhetoric here at Berkeley. Her work in philosophy has pushed the limits of thinking in diverse intellectual contexts, and most recently in artificial intelligence and its links with colonial thinking, for example. Among her many publications are two books, Abstract Sex, Philosophy, Biotechnology, and the Mutations of Desire from 2004, and Contagious Architecture, Computation, Aesthetics, and Space from 2013, as well as manifold articles in journals ranging from eFlux to Critical Inquiry. Tonight's talk is part of a larger project that is, I think, nearing completion, a new book on automating philosophy, which is a great title. So please join me in welcoming back to Berkeley, Luciana Parisi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, David, for getting me back here. I always enjoy coming back and see old friends and making new friends. Thank you for the center, for the support, the organization, and making this happen today. So I'm gonna delve in straight into my talk because if any of you has already read some of my stuff, it's quite intense. So it requires, a lot of attention. So I'm sorry about that. I hope you are caffeinated. And yeah, and also I would like to give more space at the end for question. And please, make notes for any questions you have, because some of this material is well cooked as is part of my, long-term investment in the critical technology, but some of it is also new and experimental. So let's get in. Okay, so as I said, today I'm going to share some reflection on how technology in the essence of artificial intelligence has come to challenge the fundamentals of modern epistemology, namely how secular knowledge answers the ontological question of what is, and how it concerns the triangulation of life, thought, and being. In particular, I draw on Jamaican theorist Sylvia Wynter, that's my prompt, and an argument about the indissoluble bond of colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism as fundamental and foundational to the epistemological enterprise, and thus something that lies at the core of the very question of knowledge, and consequently of what knowledge can become in the age of artificial intelligence. According to Sylvia Wynter, the modern project of epistemology is characterized by evolutionary and biological explanations that justify the centrality of what she calls man-to, namely exposing the disconnection between the human and human sapiens as objects of knowledge and the self-determining authority of the statements that describe it. The selected form of the Homo economicus comes to represent the ontological form of man. However, if the bioevolutionary explanation that justifies the modern enterprise of colonial patriarchy and economy of capitalism tended to separate the ontology of man from the explanation of its existence, with World War II advance of cybernetics and computation, a new focus on information, on recursivity and indeterminacy has opened up epistemology to a form of knowledge, a form of being, a form of thought that is, as it were, incomplete. In particular, one must notice that the modern quest for the origin of life, thought, and being has given way to a principle of uncertainty, for which whatever is said by an observer, meaning that all that is stated has a causal effect on what is said. What Wynter defines as recursive epistemology, a term that she coined by being influenced by anthropologist and cybernetician Gregory Bateson when she was working at Stanford in the 80s, defines this causal activity as transforming the fundamental paradigms of knowledge, and also the modern division between the natural from the artificial, of the organic from the technical. So my talk today addresses whether and how this activity, this causal activity, can challenge the entanglement of colonial patriarchal capitalism with information science and artificial intelligence. So recently, I was reading this book by physicist Sami Imari Walker, who addressed the need to reopen the quest of life origins as a way to address what life is beyond the opposition between the organic and the inorganic, the natural and the technical. For Walker, the biosphere is already evolving and transforming into a technosphere, whose capacity of assembling all forms of knowledge may have sufficient intelligence to solve the quest of its own emergence. While Walker, interestingly, Walker poses the problem of the future of nature, of the future of knowledge as a problem of information. For her work intends to break the barrier between the biological code and the computational code, and argue that information is part of physics. So that's a big statement. Information as a mode of abstraction of patterns and rules also forces us to reconsider the conception of the material. Whereas Walker's perspective emphasizes the centrality of information in bridging the gap between biological and physical systems, information, she argues, is a fundamental element of reality, which plays a key role in the understanding of complexity and the emergence of life. Walker examines how information principle may explain the transition from living to living matter. And she advocates for information as a unifying framework across disciplines. Similarly to the second order cybernetics, in terms of, maybe some of you are familiar with Umberto Maturana and Varela notion of autopoiesis, Walker sees information as shaping thinking. So information is shaping thinking and is not just a descriptor of thought. In other words, all the information produced is part of how we think. We are part of a lineage of events stemming from the origin of life. Instead of our atoms and molecules, our present is only the current instance of propagating information, and everything we do is part of this lineage. So for Walker, our technology cannot be decoupled from the concept of life. And thus solving the quest of life is for her a technical feat. By drawing a parallelism between or with the mathematician John von Neumann, and we know that John von Neumann helped us to have a conceptual design of a stored program digital computer in the form of a physical operation. Walker discusses the need of a universal constructor, an abstract device that can, in principle, assemble any constructible object. Similar to Alan Turing's quest of a universal Turing machine, however, Walker highlights that it's not possible to know in advance all the possible procedures of algorithms. In this case, therefore, it's not possible to know when the computer program will halt. If the universal Turing machine famously addresses the problem of the incomputable, namely that there are so many functions, so many realities that cannot be computed in discrete algorithmic form, also, she argues, the universal constructor must be truly open to evolution. From this standpoint, the technosphere is what she calls a universal constructor, because it can offer us the chance to algorithmically generate reality or objects by learning from all the information that there has ever been, both genetic and mimetic, right? Genes and memes, so culture and genes. For Walker, the future of knowledge will not, however, be met by artificial intelligence, but rather by what she calls embodied intelligence, which is enabled by the interface of biology and chemistry. She suggests that the real innovation is not in robotic, but rather in a universal programming language associated with chemical synthesis. What needs to be built, she says, is a search engine for matter that can allow us to explore chemical synthesis at a scalable way. So embedded intelligence for Walker will contribute to automate the process of chemical synthesis and produce molecule, but also genes and memes on demand. Since information is causal, therefore, for Walker, what we call the future is also constructed by information as an act of imagination. So this question of finding a universal constructor for the synthesis of the past and therefore of the future of life and on being and thought is also a question not of representation, but it's a question that needs to address the problem of artificial intelligence or of recursive knowledge of artificial intelligence as a way to challenge the racializing, gendering, and sexuated patterns of information. The question is, can embodied intelligence do that? This question for me is not just aimed to extend the critique of AI and therefore claim for the inclusion or representation of the other in embedded intelligence, or just for correcting artificial intelligence in order to challenge its epistemological biases. This question instead is concerned for, my question instead is concerned with alternative originations of knowledge. And especially from, that can answer the question and invite by Bernard Stiegler, who calls upon a defense of thought in the realm of the grammatization of thinking represented by artificial intelligence today. So in a recent article, the late Bernard Stiegler, entitled New Diversity, Techno-Diversity, he warns us against this inescapable computational condition that has affected global culture in the aftermath of planetary pandemic. He says, we all today face the question concerning technology. Stiegler, like Martin Heidegger, sees the hegemony of calculation as the enframing of the world through the dominance of information. Stiegler laments of this computational grammatization of the world, which profoundly threatened the preservation of biodiversity and technodiversity. To challenge the homogenization of thinking, Stiegler invites us to engage with Heidegger reflections on the question of technology. While the cybernetic functions of smooth communication were taken by Martin Heidegger as a symptom of the unconcealing of being, today's intensified form of what Stiegler calls exomatic evolution, namely technology or tertiary retention, is leading us to an irreversible transformation in imagination, intellect, and intuition. Stiegler, therefore, exhorts us to engage with the theoretical principle of computer science. He says we need to rethink the fundamentals of computation in order to intervene and counteract this entropic tendency of our post-data economy. He focused, therefore, on a political possibility of a new form of noetic life, which requires, he says, an engagement and not a neglect of computational sciences, especially in their cognitive, perceptive, and imaginative transformation of thinking, of the social world, of philosophy, and so on. But he laments that both philosophy, especially in its form of post-structuralist thinking, has neglected the role that mathematics, especially mathematics merging with physics, has actually led to an impoverishment of theory and therefore of philosophy. As these forms of mathematical physics become applied to algorithms, he argues, there is no possibility for a theory that can actually reinvent or re-envision the relation between techniques and culture. Stigler's interest, however, goes further than that. In fact, he advocates for an alternative. And this is, one of my questions, is there an alternative that can actually place, in his view, the importance of technodiversity against this integrated hegemony of platform capitalism, AI capitalism, whatever you want to call it. Stigler insists that a break or a bifurcation in epistemology or in the epistemology of calculation must happen. And he says, if improbability is diversity, so we associate improbability with diversity, with biodiversity and technodiversity, the probable, the statistically calculable result, i.e. the probable, is, he says, the entropic tendency towards the elimination of the diverse, end quote. So the probable corresponds to the entropic eradication of difference, but the improbable is the space for the unexpected, the unforeseen, the black swan, or the flaw at the origin of a possible collapse. This generative dimension of calculation becomes for Stigler the starting point from where critical research into theoretical science can open up to biodiversity and technodiversity. But this cannot happen, he argues, without a radical re-engagement with the very principle of no diversity. So what is no diversity? No diversity for Stigler is at the very core of the generation of knowledge. He takes this notion from Aristotle. And there's a quote, I follow Aristotle peri pusces, the knowing soul is named noetic, and noesis is a modality of the relation to the prime mover, a relation constitutive of the passion of an emotion imparting motion, the cognitive emotion moving the unmovable theos. So for Aristotle, nous is still defines the origin of knowledge, which is, however, theological. But Stigler wants to shift this and say Aristotle is useful to think about this form of knowledge that is, as it were, collective. But instead of thinking of it in terms of a theological achievement, he thinks of it in terms of a technological enterprise. So this origin of knowledge for Stigler rather consists not in just some kind of abstract knowledge, but in the artifacts, supplements, and prostheses, which together make up what he calls the technical milieu, intended as a combination of environments in which the human being is itself invented. According to Stigler, Aristotle was in no position to think that which the history of philosophy of the West in general has made it difficult to address, is that at the origin of this distinction between the noetic and the sensitive is actually technique. So the process of the reorigination of thinking, of knowledge, of being, is the process of exteriorization, namely technique. So since Stigler considers human life as co-constituted by technology, this exteriorization of a techne mind, right? It's not just a mind, it's not just biological. He sees negentropic forces as giving rise and originating to new forms of life, new forms of thought. For Stigler, the incalculable, in particular, must become a fundamental question for theoretical computer science, and needs to be accompanied by collective activity or social experiments. Incalculability, for Stigler, defines the irreducible difference of the understanding and of reason. So for Stigler, this kind of challenge of rethinking this kind of what he calls also the neg anthropological potential of knowledge can only occur if you actually cultivate new diversity through social diversity. That is social diversity that takes care of the noetic heritage. It takes care of the heritage of knowledge of the past, of its languages, archives, work, and noetic exteriority in general. So other forms of techno living. But the threat to no diversity for Stigler is also presented as a struggle to preserve, right? So it's a way to open up, but also in order to open up to techno-diversity, there's an effort, a gesture within his thinking that we need to preserve the bond between biodiversity and techno-diversity, which is a project that was already started by Yu Kuei notion of cosmotechnics. So I don't know if you're familiar with it, but that's another kind of contribution to this kind of effort to think of alternative of epistemology or techno-epistemology. So just a little bit of reminder of what is cosmotechnics, why it's important also for Stigler. So for Yu Kuei, cosmotechnics points to a unification of the cosmos and the moral through technical activities, whether craft making or art making. That's what it means. Where proposition of cosmotechnics is therefore above all an effort to theorize techno-diversity, the need of techno-diversity under the regime of grammatization of thinking. To do so, however, it clarifies that it is necessary to broaden the concept of techniques away from the dominant critique of technology. So if Heidegger distinguished the essence of Greek techne intended here as craft and poiesis, from modern technology or modern technique, it is also true that Heidegger critique, according to Ware, does not give much space to other forms of techniques, and thus presents the question of technology as a one homogeneous whole, as a universal product of modernity, which is, as it were, almost naturally evolved from the Greek. Ware proposition does not match, however, with ontological pluralism. Is not, I guess some of you are familiar with this gesture of the ontological pluralism of actually looking for alternative cosmologies before modern techno-capital. Because he argues the ontological pluralism does the error of neglecting exactly the problem of modernity and of technology. And yet is very willing of opening the question of technology beyond this model of universal enframing, which is central to Heidegger. But what he does is that he gives us an example of what is this cosmotechnics, and he turns to China. He wrote this book of The Question of Technology in China, the modern question of technology in China. So it turns to China as only one, he says. This is only one example, one of the instances of, a modern investment, understanding of theorization of technology that is not derived from strictly European culture. As a way to offer a history of cosmotechnics defined by the history of intellectual discourse on the unity and relation between Qi and Dao, the unification of the moral and the cosmic, who insists that this effort of unifying the moral and the cosmic through the technical concerns any culture. It's an enterprise that every cultural quest techno-cultural quest can start. In other words, it proposes a sort of reappropriation of modern technology through a renewed framework for a cosmotechnics that is open to different epistemology and different episteme. However, while this conception of cosmotechnics aims to break, right, the universality of technology, the universality of information, even in the exception of Sarah Walker, one question for me still remains. How can this theorization of technodiversity preclude a return, preclude what Winter calls the recursive epistemology of the colonial logic of interiority and exteriority, where difference always comes to coincide yet again with this negentropic complexification, a negentropic complexification of a self-determining subject? How can technodiversity expose a break within this universal form of techne, which is still entangled to an idea of instrumentality, to an idea of a servo-mechanical image of machines, and which is at the very core of racial capitalism? So in order to answer this question, I turn to the critique of recursive epistemology, which is at the core of the Black radical tradition and at the core of the Black anti-colonial feminist critique that Denise Ferreira da Silva offers to the concept of difference and negentropic differentiation. So to open up, to question this demarcation of difference as what saves us and its complexification from the homogeneity of universal capital, I turn to Denise Ferreira da Silva. From this standpoint, it's possible for me to argue that it's not new diversity that one will have to address in order to refound theoretical computer science and philosophical computer science, but rather to the racializing structure of power that prescribes the limits of knowledge according to the principles of linearity, sequentiality, and discreteness. It is therefore not possible to disentangle Western epistemology of computer science and its technical tendency from the homogeneity of computational capital without first accounting for the racializing onto-epistemology that precisely sustains philosophy, critical thinking on the one hand, and computational theoretical science on the other. If nosology affords diversity, it is so only according to a logic of inclusion and exclusion, interiority and exteriority, that constitutes philosophy as metaphysics, mainly as a model of thought that is separated from its medium, from its servo-mechanic instrument. Since for Stigler, the medium is techne, what he calls an organology of crafting and preservation of lived knowledges, technodiversity seems not enough for me to divorce computational thinking from the metaphysics of the one, but also from the calculation of the many. However, for me to make this point clear, I need to tell you something else. And I would like to now at least go back into alternative mode of computation in its kind of theoretical, critical theoretical form. Oh, sorry, I didn't give you this. Did I give you this? Yes. I did. Okay, very good. So I'm going backward instead of going forward, which is forward. Yeah. So very, very briefly, but perhaps a little bit crudely. Let me now turn to two attempts in critical theory of technology that instead have re-theorized computational metaphysics by accounting for this centrality of the incalculable, the incomputable, or contingent in computation, right? That what breaks this kind of discrete, linear, universal, homogeneous form of formal knowledge. So, for instance, media philosopher Alex Galloway has insisted on the centrality of the uncomputable to suggest that the existence of elements in the world, there are elements in the world, that remain outside the reach of algorithmic logic and digital representation. The uncomputable encompasses phenomena and ideas the computational system cannot fully capture, represent, or even process. Galloway draws attention to the limits of computational capabilities, pointing to knowledges and reality that remain rather opaque, that are important, they importantly refuse to be transparent to a logical explainability. In particular, the black box, there's so much discussion about opening up the black box, rethinking about how we can make transparent the biases of the black box. But for him, the black box of computation exists beyond the grasp of digital systems. And it is aesthetics, like the language of the sensible for him, which is where the uncomputable enters the world of complexity, ambiguity, and incompleteness. Galloway also argues that the uncomputable is not just fundamental to aesthetics, it's not just something that exists outside epistemology, but it's actually internal to exactly mathematical and computational models. And this is the way him and other people, including me, refer to the incompleteness theorem in Gödel, or the limit of computation in the Alan Turing universal machine. So the incomplete, what remains uncompressible, or if it's uncompressible, it's only to deliver difference, is what points to the impossibility of digital culture to encompass difference and unpredictability. So almost in this instance, it's not even possible an alternative form of epistemology, right? Because the black box must maintain its capacity to refuse compressibility or computability. On the other hand, another work I want to quickly mention is Beatrice Fazzi, notion of computational contingency, through which she refers to the inherent uncertainty, complexity, and unpredictability of computation. Her effort is to open up formal language to the contingency of its own postulation, and shows that indeterminacy actually plays a critical role in shaping the outcomes of computational output and the reliability of algorithmic behavior. For Fazzi, again, similarly, contingency originates within computational systems, and exposes this kind of dynamic relationship between the formal structure of the code and the unpredictable behavior that can emerge from these complex spaces, so from a space of calculation. So the space, instead of separating the incalculable and the calculable, she's arguing that within formal systems of computation or mathematical theory of computation, already the incalculable, already the contingent is at play. So this insistence on indeterminacy in computation, right, keeps on coming back as a potential for rethinking epistemology, or rethinking this relation of this relation of information as part of what is already, as part of what we already are. So information not as an object of science, but information as part of the production of knowledge. And this kind of elimination of this break between the explanation and the utterance. So the explanation, the scientific explanation of what information is, and who says how it is said that information is. There is this kind of collapse, and that's what Walker, that's why for me she's so interesting, and says something that is very similar to Winter, what Winter is arguing. It's impossible to maintain this paradox. But another thing that I was thinking in my reading of Walker and this question of the universality of information is actually how this question of information cannot be divorced from the problem of noise, right? Because for some of you who know a bit of media theory or digital media theory, we know that the fundament of information is always in its entropic or negentropic relation to noise. So if for Stigler, self-regulatory intelligence can compress noise and transform unpatterned energy into incrementally complex, diverse information, I'm rather suggesting that it is this model of the negentropic generation of knowledge that must be turned upside down. For negentropy takes noise as being too directly the inverse of information. So my question is, like, what if information and noise are not in a direct opposition, but actually are part of this production of knowledge? And for this, I turn to Cecilia Malaspina, who wrote this fantastic book in 2018, An Epistemology of Noise. So in this book, she says that an epistemology of noise is possible. Right? It's counterintuitive, but that's what she says. Noise neither stands for an unknowable nor for a given probability. So it's not just part of statistic or like the incomputable in a way. You could also argue that is calculated, can be approximated. But she says, no, it's not a given probability. By asking how does knowledge constitute itself in the face of contingency, Malaspina therefore brings back another fundamental of mathematics for computer science, which is Close-Shannon mathematical theory of communication, where information is aligned to unpredictability, and ideas of uncertainty rest at the core of epistemology. And constitute learning as an endemic constructivism. So for her, in the face of contingency, noise, the centrality of noise is what allows for an endemic constructivism of and within contingency. Here, information is entropic. Certainty is comprised within a lack of information. That's very interesting. So certainty is comprised within a lack of information. And incompleteness becomes the causal form of the real. So Malaspina argues that this negative contradiction between noise and information actually constitute many disciplines, from cybernetics to psychology, from computation to cognition. Noise as a material form, she says, which coincides with the noise of cognition constituting itself, against the always looming crisis of its dissolution. So the noise of cognition constituting itself against the always looming crisis of its dissolution. In this sense, knowledge is neither predictable nor ultimately fallacious. It is rather involved in what she calls a process-oriented language starting from the stance of uncertainty. More so, she argues, knowledge is thus of uncertainty. So knowledge is of uncertainty. And starting with this kind of parallelism, almost a flattening, actually, of information's noise, the extension of epistemology, she argues, is also an extension of cognition. Here, instrumentality, technique is not prosthesis, is not a tertiary retention, is not the extension of racial patriarchal capital, but must turn into away from a probability of and for the extraction of value. So the view that sees noise as a negentropic complexity or as useful information, I would argue, is just a teleological affair. As opposed to this negentropic complexification of the same cosmogony, Malaspina helps to theorize noise as the negation of contingency. We can talk more about this in the Q&A, but we can unpack it more. The negation of contingency, which exposes how noise is central to meaningful yet incomplete forms. Rather than defining noise as contingency that must be negated, sublated into the value of a commodity fetish, Malaspina argues that this double negation exposes the generative and meaningful negation of order. Noise bears this double negation as an index of refusal, namely refusing the opposition between noise and information, inclusion and exclusion. But how there can be novelty and certainty, unknown and patterns at the same time, right? How this can happen? How can there be novelty and certainty, unknown and patterns at the same time? Malaspina suggests that this paradoxical articulation transpires in Shannon conception of information as a process and not a sequence. So a process and not a sequence. As much as information is also uncertainty, information is not given. Rather, it increases, rather uncertainty is what increases with both information and noise. So going back to Walker, it's not just information that increases or that can be open or can open knowledge, but also noise. As much as, for instance, generative AI, such as ChatGPT, are taught to learn from natural languages and speak English according to the logic of grammar, the temporal rules of verbs, the premise of subject, the categorical classification of object, so too one must reflect that the AI comes to expose the potentiality of noise and information by learning to navigate a space for potential syntactical acts of semantic interaction, by learning to navigate this space and produce alien wording, incomplete concepts. If AI comes to learn and speak another language, for instance, it is because what it has negatively negated, i.e. the automating, proliferating, algorithmic compression of noise and information, returns in the semantic use of syntax, where the generative language also carries within itself the marks of the violence of linguistic grammar that continues to expose the noise of the alien sense, carrying negative noise information everywhere. I'm almost done. From this standpoint, one could argue the Stigler proposition of refunding theoretical computer science by accounting for the improbable or negative entropy in calculation may indeed contribute to the abolition of a colonial logic of exclusion and extraction, and the now diffuse proletarization of all culture under the dominance of computational capitalism. Similarly, one could consider how Stigler's development of the mission of cosmotechnics to invite to the table of modern technology a plethora of non-Western metaphysics and techniques shows also how critique shall follow the technical tendency to bifurcate and diversify along the lines of difference. However, for me, it is precisely because this endless negentropic bifurcation continues to efface how the negative causality of noise of information, that actually the abolition of difference as the category of inclusion and exclusion remains impossible in its schema. So it's something that returns and as problematically returns as a kind of marker of the ontoepistemology that Winter challenges. So what may be missing from this articulation is precisely an investigation of a negative AI, where the recursivity of knowledge can no longer rely on the correlation between human and machines, as what newsology promises us, but must instead be broken apart and be wilding. And I'm almost finished. I turn to this artist and theorist, Beth Coleman, who introduces for us this concept of AI bewilding, to examine how AI systems as entities cannot behave predictably and actually their behavior extend beyond the intended design and control. Here, unpredictability and emergence are used to highlight the indeterminate and wilding behavior of natural systems, and also the kind of wilding behavior of the techno-sociogenic articulation of Blackness. Coleman critical examination of AI points to the way that noise as information coincides with the conditional function of a superposition that you see in our artwork of two or more states for which what is negated remains as such. So what is negated cannot be effaced, but the negative negation that Western ontoepistemology does of a for Blackness remains unresolved and cannot be actually, as it were, brushed away into this more adaptable form of AI. In other words, negative AI is also an alien AI that relies not on the originary or reorigination of knowledge of this techno-diverse mind, but must confront the socio-technogenic superposition of the negated negative, which for Denise Ferreira da Silva is the irreparable death of the negated existence, which is borne upon by Black bodies and Blackness, precisely in terms of improbabilities, indeterminacy, and incomputabilities. Negative AI remains a fugitive intelligence, an anti-colonial project that undoes the principle of the future of knowledge, and therefore refuses a return to the reorigination of the past, but also of the future of life. And so I just want to conclude with a quote to kind of point out that this pursuing of noise information in the externality of thinking is also a construction for a techno-sociogenic revisioning of an alien kind of knowledge. And I conclude with this quote and this wonderful work by Black artist, Black Goe Universe. I don't know if you know this artist. And Denise Ferreira da Silva says, because neither space nor time, our fundamental descriptors of the world seem to be immediately retrievable from universal reason's rather limited stance before the world. Blackness' capacity to signify otherwise beyond universality and its particular arrangement of space or time, but also away from transcendentality, self-determination, invites a consideration of the possibility of knowing without modern categories. And this is an effort that this project of negative AI is trying to do. Thank you. Yes, I can take my own questions. I'm very happy to go to any other slide if you want to go back and ask for, clarification, because there's a lot of material. Sorry, I can't be synthetic. I'm the opposite of them. But yeah. Shall I go back to any slide? Yeah. The microphone, Fatima, is the microphone.
Thank you for the talk. That was a lot of really interesting ideas. I think it's more clear to me now the argument that you've been making about the link between Sylvia Wynter and the AI question. But just to kind of clarify the negation of the negation question, the important thing is that the negation is not fully negated. It remains unassimilable to the computational, but not representing anything alternative. So it's an alien, like literally alien presence. Is that fair to say? And so the parallel with Sylvia Wynter and De Silva would be that would take the place as a parallel with blackness? Is it that
Yeah, it's
strong
not.
of a link?
Yeah, no, thank you for this question, because that's a question that might risk become a problem of analogy, right? It's not a problem of analogy. It's not that. So there's this question of one thing, the negation of the negation of noise, right? It's for Malaspina is a way in which noise is also productive, right? Or at least maintains a trace, or it demarcates something that is not assimilable or compressible into a pattern, information that, you know, for Walker, information is something that you can see as a pattern over and over again. And it's only information if it's reliable. So it is iterable more than once. There can be a speech, there can be a behavior, can be anything. It's meme, genes, everything, but it's not what is incomputable for her. So the incomputable is not reliable. So the kind of universal machine that one must construct for the future of knowledge needs to be about computation, so information. So my question is that what if we look at Malaspina intervention into the fact that actually information is never it can synthesize noise, but noise is unsynthesizable. That's very, you know, strange, right? Because obviously we have lots of machines that synthesize noise, that cut off noise from the headphones to, I don't know, the iPad, also the CD, you know, there was all this idea, the glitch remained, you hear noise, the background, you know, but the idea is that technology cancels noise. But an argument is that noise remains as a pattern that is not decipherable into information. So it's carried through. So if it's carried through, where does it lie? So what's the trace of it? For Sylvia Winter, the trace is blackness is the trace, in the sense that she talks about, you know, this question of the sociogenic, which I call techno-sociogenic, which is the way in which the flesh, which is not a body, is the material, carries this trace, this trace, which is not synthesizable. It's only synthesizable as difference in the system of representation of epistemology. Yes, it's a difference in category, all the categories that we want, and, you know, the way they can be normative or non-normative, they're still categories. Because we are talking of another layer here, of a layer that, you know, is not decipherable into a pattern, and yet it's a trace that, you know, has this kind of zero value that nonetheless is fundamental to all mathematics and philosophy. It's its origin, it's the point of origin that collapse the points of origin. So that's the kind of relation that I want to do, because the negentropic for me is part of more difference. And the more difference is part of the capacity of capital, or computational capital, to diversify, bifurcate indefinitely. And we've seen it over as a system. As opposed to, for instance, have this idea of noise as this kind of opacity in the system. I like the idea that Galloway flirted in this book about with the black box, that the black box must remain a black box, and there actually is all these layers, but then you end up becoming a bit fetishizing the black box, as you can put, you know, that's the argument of Da Silva and also Zakia Jackson, that you can fetishize blackness. So how you don't, you take it out of the system of knowledge, that at the limit of it, there's the fetish, right? So the unpredictable is the fetish. And so I think that Malaspina does a good job to bring noise as potential and also actual activity in any system. You can call it resistance, you can call it struggling, you can call it fugitivity, but it's a kind of a war machine for me. It's for, you know, more like in the Lesengateri idea, or a war machine that doesn't stop existing, even if it doesn't exist and must not exist. That's the idea. Noise doesn't exist and must not exist. So for for Winter and Silva, Zakia Jackson, the idea that obviously blackness doesn't exist and must not exist. It's not in the realm of visibility or ontological permissible. It's not allowed. So that's the kind of work that I'm doing in this kind of correlation. If that makes sense.
Thanks.
Yes.
I will definitely echo, oops, there we go. I definitely will echo David's comments. Thank you so much for the great talk. I guess my question is, I understand your position in sort of mapping the sort of negative AI through blackness. I mean, particularly in the ways in which you're thinking about the sort of refusal of the proper, the fugitivity as someone like Moten, for example, would sort of describe blackness. But in thinking about negative AI, particularly just as a phenomenon, right? I think the sort of similar conundrum, I guess, with blackness, right, is, how do you kind of speak of something without an existence, right? How do you give it language? So I guess my question for you is, in what ways are you thinking about language as it relates to the negative AI, or how it fits into the overall project itself?
Yeah, no, great question. Thank you, because language is very interesting. So I've kind of spent a little bit of time to go back into that, especially through this work of, I don't know if you call him a realist, a pragmatist, or a rationalist, Wilfred Sellers, who actually, it's very interesting because in a way, he also is arguing against a representational model of language, the empiricist, but also, some of kind of language of linguistic, right? The linguistic form of the signifier. And he says that language is an instrument, language as thought. And language is almost like an instrument for thinking. Thinking doesn't occur before you speak, right? It's a bit, some of you might remind you of some Wittgenstein, I guess, but it's this idea that there are these kind of mental events that when we think, we speak aloud, and we are talking already. So there's this, and then my question is like, so how does the kind of possibility of an artificial language can speak aloud? Obviously, the machine doesn't speak aloud. Everything that the large language model do is to actually assemble all the words, right? And then syntactically recombining the words and predict the next word because he knows all the environment that has been there around it. So it's like just a prediction. It is still like symbolic and linguistic. There's a subject, an object, the signifier, the bias, everything is there. So where is it, this form of language as a kind of thought event, or thinking as speaking aloud, or thinking as languaging, as it were. And I think that I have been interested in this kind of phenomena when there was at some point Facebook that to shut down its ChatGPT because it was just starting to beat on the market and start talking in English, and that was gibberish, right? But the gibberish, so that people didn't realize there was actually still things going on, that there was still the AI was still actually betting on the market, doing something, even if the language didn't correspond to a grammar, but the language was there. Other artists who are talking, that are talking about language in terms of syntactical constructivism or syntactical interaction. So there is this very interesting computer scientist, artist, Maverick, is called Arcadia, and he talks about topological computation. And he's talking about this topological space and how the syntax organizes in this topology. And so it's not a Euclidean form of precise, already given geometrical form, but actually the AI learns to the language association of word, or the languaging of AI happens in this interactive space of syntax. So that, I'm exploring, and then why do I call it negative, right? That's another question. people say, oh, but it's still generative. Why you call it narrative? It's generative AI. It's not negative. It's constructed. But I'm interested in what remains noise in the construction, right? Because that's not it's not a linguistic model. So it's a language, but it's not linguistic. So I'm interested in this. People might say, oh, is it glitch? Is it error? Is it contingency? Is it randomness? I guess it's all of them. Depends on where are you actually operating. But yeah, it's very interesting to me. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for coming in late. This is fascinating. So here's my question. If you hang out in computer science circles a little bit in academia and industry, a lot of these perspectives seem to be embraced. In fact, Yaqui, Galloway, especially Fauci, I think, seem to resonate quite well with people in you know, actually building AI systems. And so, of course, yeah, of course, yeah, but wait, so their vocabulary is very different, of course, and to say nothing of their ambitions, obviously. It's much less nuanced, and they don't care about the history of technology or the history of philosophy and so on. But if you look at the terms and concepts like beyond determinism, unpredictable outcomes, open-ended computation, autonomous emergent behavior, and so on, these notions are, to some extent at least, at the core of the visions and hopes of the big tech AI labs, right? And so they're even expressed in business plans and in their leadership and among lots of their investors. So my question is this: does critical thinking in AI, in the humanities today, does it need to worry about at all that this discourse aligns so well with transhumanists, EA communities, long-termism, and even mainstream AI engineers in the Valley?
Yes. I mean, I think we're talking, I'm not sure always whether these people are marketing words or are really engaging with these words, right? There was a lot talking about when I was doing my PhD on 1,000 plateau de les were in business schools, and I was in Berkeley University. So the business school and philosophy were talking the same language, but then how you talk that language, what you do with it, it's not the same, right? So I think we need to be careful in transplanting concepts, because they're just all the words. It's branding. Branding is not critical thinking, and critical thinking has a problem with computation, because or with science in general, because we always are trying always to ward off the science about calculation, it's about capital, it's about the reduction of the diversity into homogeneity. We talk about this, but I think philosophy is a problem already. That's my project. The project is that philosophy has a problem in assuming that questions of indeterminacy, uncertainty are actually openness or non-dogmatic thinking, which actually deliberates them into making this kind of self-post, assumption or axiom that are deeply racist, that work to the logical racialization, gendering, and sexuating. So for me, philosophy as a problem as the science. But you were talking about something else, about the fact that, no, I just wanted to do this preamble, because I think it's important that we say these things, that the problem that AI when AI challenges us, or technology challenges in thinking what is the origination of all this. One is really the opportunity to open up and challenge philosophy within, right? Because we've inherited 100 years of basic colonial thinking and philosophy, which is still maintained even in critical thought. That is the problem, right? And so, but then the fact that these things work very well, absolutely, because I'm talking about Shannon, Wiener, Alan Turing. These are main people. Of course, if if people in tech don't know about that, it's a problem. They should, that's the fundamental there. They should know. And Turing was very clear, in actually of being obsessed by the problem, the fallibility of a universal model of mathematics. So of course, you need to include, if you look at first model of AI, symbolic AI failed because the perceptron was not able to interact with all kinds of reality, which is instead the case of what we have today. Neural network, countryside neural network, they're all structures that are able to adapt, to actually open up, to include contingencies, except that is marketed. The contingency is marketed as a surplus, it determines or is determined by an extraction of surplus value. That is the point where extraction happens. Of course, they're interested in it. They'll be crazy not to be interested in it. So the fact that it's problematic that critical theory produces this kind of, even my work, right? They could, impossible, they would never take it, but if they will go into computer science lab or computer science language, I think the parlance is one thing, but actually the causal efficacy of whether this work really will be taken into account will really mean to disembed all the computational knowledge, right? Disembed means to unbug, to decrypt, which is impossible. They will never do. They will just add another variable to the axiom. I don't think that they are able to abolish the system of ontoepistemology that upon which technology is based. That's impossible. That would be just suicidal, right? So all they can do is just add an X and say, okay, this is contingency. We can use, I extract value from it. So it's a potentiality that becomes a probability. That's always the case. So I think I'm always interested, and I have a couple of projects on, building a kind of center for alternative AI or something that brings into question or into operation the limits of cosmotechnics, the negative, all these questions. But I have found very hard to find computer scientists who are not experimental thinkers to actually sit with me. They don't, because it's not marketable. I'm selling. It's very economical to discuss. But in terms of epistemology, sure, things go around, but I don't think they have the same impact. That's what I think. But you might think differently. I'm sure it's good too. I don't know. Yes. Another question?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I have a question about materiality. And I know it wasn't a key term in your talk, but maybe because of that, it really stood out when you had that quote from Malaspina about the materiality of noise.
Yeah.
I noted it has a material form,
Yeah.
quote, the noise of cognition constituting itself against the always looming crisis of its dissolution. And then at the end, we see, you're showing us a Black GUI universe with this very in-your-face materiality. So, I don't know if these relate, but I would love to hear you say a little bit more about materiality, either for Malaspina or maybe in relation to Black GUI universe and negativity.
Thank you so much. That's a very question too, because obviously I start with Walker point that information is material. That we actually, the fact that the information contributes to knowledge, everything information exists is part of, it's this kind of observer effect, right? Whatever you say causes something else, right? It's not just something irrelevant. It's already part of the material reality. So in a way, she's arguing that materiality is not to do with empirical, observable, or tangible. No, it's not an empirical form, but materiality has also this abstract form of information. So, but also she said that information is physical. But then they said, okay, but then what does it mean? How can you measure it? And then for her to measure it is also this universal constructor of the von Neumann, actually concretization of the first computer in a way, which points to this physicality of computation. So it's something that it's a hardware, dies, something consumes, so material in that kind of terms. So I don't know if she's talking about that, because she's not talking about the entropy of information. She's just talking about almost this information as material that is always there. even if you cannot measure, even if it's incomputable, even if it's you don't know what object the constructor can construct, but it's there. So it could be an abstract materiality, but then also for Malaspina, noise is something that makes something. And this idea of something and nothing, you know? Something you'd call it something if it's negative, right? So am I doing this kind of Socratic or pre-Socratic, oh my God, like the being and the non-being, you know? I don't want to do that because the non-being is again a trace of gives credit to the being. It's waiting for the being to appear. That had again a gesture that the conceiving and the unconceiving. So it's this kind of revealing. I'm not interested in that. I think I'm interested in this kind of incomputable patterns. That's what I'm interested in. I think that's an old love of mine, which means that there is a pattern that you don't recognize. You don't have the language, the discourse, to describe it, and yet it's always there. It's like a wound, a trace, a mark. That's what it is for me. I don't like that. So in that way, it's material, because in a way, something can record it. A body, a machine, gesture, when you dance, there are these marks that are there, that don't belong to the dominant of representation of epistemology, but are there, breaking it all the time, as it were. Yeah. Yeah.
My thinking is, so are you using noise to measure error within the process?
No, but I understand that this is a possibility, right? Because in a way, a noise as entropy is the measure. Entropy is a measure, right? So noise is being within information theory used as a measure of information. So this correlation: the more noise, the less information, or the more noise, the more information. So for Malaspina, she draws on Shannon that says that it's not possible for a signal to pass through a channel without an incrementation of noise. And this is very interesting because you find it also in diffusion model, in large language model of AI, and something called the transformer. So basically, what they do is for a machine, an intelligent machine, to recognize a pattern, you give a lot of information, and then we kind of cleans it out, and then you have the image that you want, like a cat. But before, you have a lot of cats, right? So instead of, it's a very similar idea. So instead of Shannon, this is 1928. It says the more information, the more noise, unique noise for the signal to pass. And similar now, AI needs noise to recognize an image. It's a very interesting parallel. So it's not an error, right? Because it's necessary. So it's not determinate or deterministic or determinable, but it's necessary. It's necessary to information. So what does it mean? For me, when I abstract it in terms of when I think about the system of ontoepistemology or colonial ontoepistemology, is that actually noise is needed to the constitution of knowledge. In terms that you gotta have something that is, excluded, something of a difference upon which the mark of error or noise is carried. So that's what I'm talking about when drawing with or working with Denise and Zacchaeus, this idea of what is carrying, that there's an affectable body that carries the noise. And the reason why I call it alien is because it's not visible, it cannot be categorizable. It's always, but it doesn't mean it's not known, right? But the way in which you know it is not according to the grammar. but it's more according to a machine that can record something that records it. That's what I'm interested in, in the recording of the trees. I haven't developed that very well, but there was another question. No? Okay. Oh, thank you for.
No, thank you so much.
The question? Yes, yes, and Marco, if you want. Okay.
Sorry.
So, I was working with generative AI for a while in a tech startup, and I was always
Yeah.
kind of struck by how like the images a lot of the time would mirror like sort of psychedelic or nightmarish.
Yeah, that deep dreaming.
Yeah, the like hallucination.
Yeah, no, so you talk about Dali.
Yeah, or I used to.
Okay. Mhm.
But I was just curious about when we were discussing aesthetics with Dalloway. This idea of how aesthetics, like there's certain things that are just like not computable, right? And aesthetics allow us to do that. And I was just wondering, like, I don't know, do you have thoughts about how like this kind of nightmarish element of what AI is generating or the way that what it's at right now in comparison to kind of the piece or the like, you know, the moment of nowness that isn't touchable by AI at the moment.
What is not touchable? Sorry.
I don't know. I just have this image of generative AI getting to a point with like VR and everything where it can be almost really reality. But there's this like here and nowness within the idea of aesthetics, or just their own aesthetics that isn't touchable. I think it won't be touched, right? So I don't know. Very very big.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because obviously, you know, the tendency is to make it more and more, you know, representational, right? So I guess that that's why it's insisting you need to maintain opacity. Because, you know, you can render this word, we can all be in a simulation right now, you know, and I think it's a possibility that can, you know, in a virtual environment very well happen. Instead of having Zoom, we have this thing and move around, everything, you know, it's becoming more and more transparent that aesthetic. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, maybe I'll go up to you.
But in any case, you know, even in that kind of, which is a bit like Black Mirror scenarios, you know, that you actually have the simulation, you don't know, but you know, there's a very old thing, you know, Plato was saying already, you are in a simulation, we don't know. It's actually interesting to then think where the uncomputable is, right? How does the machine can render, you know, your reality without actually you realizing that you don't have a reality because you're not better, you know, you cannot stay outside of the machine. And that is the point that, you know, every information, everything you are to the world, you are the world. If you follow astrophysicist Sarah Wolf, which is but it's but we can talk a bit later. Thank you very much.